With violent crime on the rise, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police is calling for a meeting with the premiers to discuss the safety of Canada's officers. Now, this was spelled out in a letter addressed to the chair of the Council of the Federation, Manitoba Premier Heather Stefanson. In it, the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, Danny Smythe, requested this urgent meeting. The association would like to discuss the rise in violent crime, bail reform, and the recent killings of police officers. The letter highlights concern for the safety of officers amid a rise in guns, gangs, drugs, and violence. It notes the impact of mental health and addiction on the rise in violent crime and the increasing issue of repeat offenders. Well, joining us now to unpack the objectives of the meeting with the premiers is Chief Danny Smythe himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Now, in addition to highlighting this rise in violent crime in Canada, what would be the main objectives of this meeting with the premier, sir?
Well, as policing in Canada is generally provincial jurisdiction, I think it's a timely meeting. As I speak to my colleagues across the country, I recognize that many of us are facing the same problems, and you've outlined many of them. In addition, we're seeing a prolific use of guns and gun weapons in the community. So I just think it's a good opportunity to sit down with the premiers, looking for their support as we try to tackle some of these complex problems.
And you're saying that policing is at a crossroads in Canada amid this rise in violent crime. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by this?
Well, in part, often we're used to seeing news in the United States, and all of a sudden we are seeing a number of officer deaths. We've had 8 officers killed since September in violent, random kind of incidents. We're not used to that in Canada, and it's pretty alarming. I'll tell you, I was in Edmonton just a couple of weeks ago for the funeral there, and I didn't even wake up the next morning to discover yet another death in Quebec. So these are coming much quicker than we're used to in Canada, and we're seeing a lot of the same overlap. Certainly, guns is coming into play, mental health is coming into play. There are instances where some of the offenders that were involved in these were repeat offenders that were out on bail. As much as the focus is on police, I should point out that there's just as much harm in our communities that's occurring as well. So I just think these are timely things to try to sit down and discuss.
Meanwhile, all of this comes amid some criticism against policing in Canada, sir. We know there are concerns around racism, abuse of power, and even calls to potentially defund or reduce funding for policing services. So where does the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police stand when it comes to these concerns in particular?
Well, I think accountability and transparency is built into our system. That is one of the big distinctions in Canada compared to some of our um, fellow organizations in the United States. Most provinces have legislation that prescribes independent investigations when police are involved in any incidents that involve injury or death. Most services have regulations that uh, you know uh, address things like abuse of authority. So I do think the system is there. Can it improve? Always it can improve, but I think we're well served in Canada to address many of the concerns that have been brought forward.
And you previously mentioned that policing should be part of the strategy when it comes to addressing these issues. So, what does being part of the strategy look like for policing in Canada?
Well, I think Alberta is a good example where I saw, a lot of city, local council governments debating whether they should defund police and go in a different direction without actually involving the police. And then oftentimes you'll see provinces, talking a different message. Our members are hearing a very mixed message depending on what jurisdiction you're in. I don't think there can be public safety in Canada without the police. And I think it's important for us to be at the table. The police aren't the only part of the solution, but we're a big part of it.
All right, Chief Smythe, just about 45 seconds left here, but what would a successful meeting with the Council of the Federation look like?
Well, in part, I think just from a morale perspective, just having their support publicly would go a long way for our members. But as you saw, after the death of the OPP officer in December, just seeing the premiers come together and use their influence to try to make some changes to bail reform, goes a long way to addressing some of the concerns that we've brought forward. I would argue that additional resources in mental health and addictions would also give us the opportunity to divert people into programming as opposed to using the justice system.
We look forward to following the developments of this meeting. Chief Smythe, thank you again for your time today.
Thank you for your interest. Have a good evening.